Every day at the same time, a loyal dog walks to a grave in a quiet cemetery. Intrigued, the caretaker decides to follow him, and what he discovers changes his life forever. This is a story of love, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond that even time cannot erase. Diego adjusted his cap as he watched the dog from a distance. It was the 5th day in a row, and the pattern was unmistakable. The scruffy, brown-coated mutt trotted through the cemetery gates at exactly 4 p.m. Unleashed and unbothered by the presence of visitors, it navigated the winding paths with purpose. Diego followed the animal with his eyes, curiosity turning into unease. The dog stopped at a particular grave, sat down, and stared at the headstone as if expecting something. No barking, no sniffing, no digging, just silent, unwavering stillness. Diego tightened his grip on the broom handle he'd been holding, a chill creeping up his spine. He knew the grave well. It belonged to Manuel Garcia, a reclusive old man who'd passed away 3 months earlier. Diego had attended the small funeral himself, standing at the edge of the gathering out of respect. But this was strange. "Shoo!" he called out from a distance, waving the broom in the air. The dog didn't flinch. Diego gritted his teeth, tossed the broom aside and walked toward the animal. "You can't just hang around here," he muttered, his tone harsher than he intended. The dog turned its head slightly, just enough to acknowledge Diego's presence. Its eyes were dark and calm, unfazed by the interruption. Diego stopped in his tracks, a lump forming in his throat. There was something unsettlingly human in that gaze, something that froze him in place. After a long pause, the dog turned back to the grave. Diego shook his head, breaking the moment. "All right, fine," he muttered. "Stay here. But don't blame me when the groundskeeper chases you out." He turned and walked away, muttering under his breath about stray animals and strange habits. The rest of his evening passed uneventfully, but the image of the dog sitting by Manuel's grave refused to leave his mind. He lay awake in his small apartment that night, replaying the scene. It wasn't unusual for stray dogs to wander the cemetery. Food scraps left by visitors often attracted them, but this felt different. Purposeful. Intentional. By the next day, Diego was determined to learn more. When 4 p.m. arrived, Diego was ready. He leaned against a mausoleum, pretending to sweep, his eyes fixed on the cemetery gates. Right on cue, the dog appeared. It followed the same path, tail wagging slightly as it approached Manuel's grave. Diego watched closely, noting every step. This time he didn't try to intervene. Instead, he approached slowly, keeping his distance. He crouched a few feet away, observing the dog's behavior. As before, it sat motionless, its eyes fixed on the grave. "Why here?" Diego whispered, more to himself than the dog. He glanced at the headstone, the familiar inscription staring back at him. Manuel Garcia. 1943 to 2023. Beloved husband and friend. The word husband stood out. Manuel had been a widower for years, a quiet man who rarely spoke to anyone. Diego had seen him visit this very cemetery almost daily, always carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. Now it seemed the dog had taken his place. Diego's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to see a woman in her late 30s approaching, holding a bag of groceries. Her eyes darted between Diego and the dog. "Is that Tito?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. "Tito?" Diego echoed. "Yes, Manuel's dog," she said, setting down her bag. "I used to see them together all the time. Manuel took him everywhere. After he passed, I thought Tito had disappeared." Diego's heart sank. The dog, Tito, wasn't just a stray. He was mourning. The woman crouched down, holding out her hand. "Hey Tito," she said softly. The dog turned his head toward her but didn't move. His focus returned to the grave. Diego stood silently, the weight of the moment pressing on him. What kind of bond would bring a dog back to a place like this, day after day? And why now, after all this time? The woman sighed, standing back up. "I guess some connections don't break no matter what," she said, picking up her groceries. "Take care of him, will you?" Diego nodded, though he wasn't sure what that meant. As the woman walked away, he looked back at Tito. The dog's stillness wasn't just loyalty, it was a question waiting to be answered. And Diego wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Diego stood in the fading sunlight, staring at Tito as the weight of the previous day's discovery lingered in his mind. Manuel's dog. The words played over and over, weaving themselves into the routine of his thoughts. How could an animal, often dismissed as incapable of deep emotions, show such unwavering loyalty? The next afternoon, Diego decided he would do more than watch. As the clock approached 4 p.m., He positioned himself discreetly behind a cluster of stone mausoleums, broom in hand, pretending to work. Right on schedule, Tito appeared. The dog's routine was precise: enter the gates, take the left path, stop at Manuel's grave. Diego followed at a careful distance, ensuring Tito wouldn't notice. Today though, Diego wasn't alone. A small group of visitors wandered nearby, leaving flowers on their loved ones' graves. A child ran past Tito, laughing as his mother called him back. The dog remained unbothered, his gaze locked on the headstone. Diego, crouching behind a statue of an angel, observed Tito's every move. Minutes passed, but Tito didn't budge. Diego felt a strange pull to speak, to say something, anything, to the silent animal. Slowly he stepped out of his hiding spot and approached the grave. "All right, Tito," Diego muttered, his voice low and cautious. "What's so special about this place? What are you holding on to?" Tito's ears twitched at the sound of his name. He turned his head briefly toward Diego, then back to the grave. Diego exhaled sharply, crouching beside the dog. "You don't give much away, do you?" Diego said, half joking. Manuel must have been a good man to deserve this kind of devotion. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, ruffling Diego's shirt and the fur on Tito's back. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stilled, the sounds of distant traffic and birdsong fading into the background. Tito shifted, laying down with his head resting on his paws. Diego sighed, his curiosity outweighing his reservations. He reached out, cautiously placing his hand on Tito's back. The dog didn't pull away. His fur was coarse, a mix of dirt and wear, but there was a warmth to him, a sense of presence that Diego hadn't expected. "You're not just any dog," Diego murmured. "You're waiting for something." That night, Diego couldn't shake the encounter. He sat at his small kitchen table, a plate of untouched food in front of him, and replayed the scene in his mind. Why would Tito return to this grave every day? Was it routine? Grief? Or something deeper that Diego couldn't yet comprehend? The following morning, Diego decided to act. He stopped by the local corner store on his way to the cemetery, buying a loaf of bread and a small bag of dog food. As he handed the cashier a few crumpled bills, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. Why was he investing so much time in this dog? What was he hoping to find? By the time he arrived at the cemetery, Tito was already there. The dog sat in his usual spot, unmoving, a sentinel guarding a memory. Diego approached slowly, setting the bag of food and a small bowl of water a few feet away. "Here," Diego said softly. "I don't know if you're hungry, but it's the least I can do." Tito sniffed the air but didn't move from the grave. Diego stepped back, giving the dog space. Minutes passed and finally Tito stood, his movements deliberate. He walked over to the bowl, drank deeply, then ate a few bites of the food. Diego watched, a strange sense of satisfaction blooming in his chest. "You're stubborn," Diego said with a faint smile. "But I think I get it. You're waiting for him, aren't you?" Tito finished eating and returned to his place by the grave. Diego stayed longer than usual that day, sitting a few feet away, lost in thought. Manuel's name on the headstone felt heavier now, as though it carried a story Diego was only beginning to understand. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Diego stood and stretched. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, half expecting an answer. Tito didn't react, his eyes fixed on the grave. Walking home, Diego felt something shift within him. Tito wasn't just mourning, he was teaching Diego something he couldn't yet articulate. But one thing was clear: Diego was no longer a passive observer. He was part of this story now, and he had a feeling it was far from over. Diego arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual the next day, his curiosity outweighing his usual routines. He carried the same bag of dog food and water bowl, along with a notebook and pen tucked under his arm. If Tito's behavior was as deliberate as it seemed, Diego wanted to document it. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the unanswered questions buzzing in his mind, or maybe he felt this peculiar situation deserved to be preserved. At 3:55 p.m., Diego leaned against the mausoleum nearest the gate, watching. Right on time, Tito emerged, his pace steady and unhurried. Diego followed discreetly, observing the way Tito's paws seemed to instinctively find the path to Manuel's grave. The dog paused before the headstone as usual, sitting quietly as if waiting for someone to speak first. Diego crouched behind a nearby statue, scribbling notes. Tito arrives at exactly 4 p.m. No hesitation. Focused. He felt ridiculous, like an amateur detective chasing a mystery that might not even exist. But the questions wouldn't stop. Why did Tito keep coming back? Did dogs grieve the way humans did? Could it be loyalty or something deeper? Something Diego didn't yet understand? For the first time, Diego decided to approach the grave while Tito was still sitting there. As he stepped forward, Tito's ears perked up, but the dog didn't move. Diego sat on the ground a few feet away, his notebook resting on his lap. "All right, Tito," Diego said softly. "You've got my attention. Now what?" The dog turned his head briefly, his dark eyes meeting Diego's. There was something profound in that gaze, as though Tito were carrying the weight of a story he couldn't tell. Diego shifted uncomfortably, breaking eye contact. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Answers, maybe, or some sign that he was on the right track. Instead, there was silence. Diego flipped open his notebook and began jotting down his thoughts. The dog doesn't seem anxious. No signs of distress. It's like he knows this is where he's supposed to be. He paused, tapping the pen against the page. What would Manuel say if he were here? Would he explain, or would he let the dog's actions speak for themselves? The sound of footsteps interrupted Diego's thoughts. He looked up to see an older man approaching, his face lined with years of sun and labor. The man tipped his hat as he neared. "You're watching Tito, huh?" the man said, his voice rough but kind. Diego nodded. "You know him?" "Everyone in this part of town does," the man replied. He was Manuel's shadow. Went everywhere with him, market, park, you name it. After Manuel passed, I thought Tito might disappear, but here he is. Diego hesitated. "Why do you think he keeps coming back?" The man scratched his chin, glancing at the dog. "Hard to say. Maybe he's waiting for something. Or maybe he just doesn't know where else to go." Manuel was all he had. The words settled heavily on Diego. He thanked the man, who tipped his hat again before walking away. Diego turned back to Tito, who was now lying down, his head resting on his paws. "You're waiting," Diego murmured, more to himself than the dog. But for what? That evening, Diego couldn't focus on anything else. He searched the internet for articles about dogs and grief, scrolling through stories of pets who had stayed by their owners' graves for years. Some were dismissed as urban legends, but others were backed by research suggesting animals could experience loss in ways that paralleled human emotions. Diego's chest tightened as he read. The idea that Tito could be mourning Manuel struck a chord he hadn't expected. Diego thought about his own life, his isolation, his routines. He didn't have anyone waiting for him, and he wasn't sure he was waiting for anyone either. The next day, Diego arrived at the cemetery with a new plan. He wasn't just going to observe, he was going to learn. He brought a small bag of wildflowers, the kind Manuel used to carry, and placed them on the grave beside Tito. The dog sniffed them briefly, then looked at Diego. "What do you think?" Diego asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Did I get it right?" Tito didn't answer, of course, but he stayed by the grave as Diego sat beside him. The two of them, man and dog, shared the quiet space, both holding on to questions neither could fully articulate. Diego arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual again, but this time he wasn't just waiting for Tito. He had a plan, a need to dig deeper, figuratively and perhaps literally, into Manuel's story. Tito's routine had become predictable, but the unanswered questions gnawed at Diego, keeping him up at night. What connected this dog so profoundly to a man no longer here? Tito arrived as he always did, his steady gait unbroken. Diego watched from a distance, still amazed by the dog's consistency. But today he wasn't interested in simply observing. Instead, he set down a small folding chair and waited near the grave. Tito seemed to pause at Diego's unexpected presence, but after a moment, carried on as if nothing had changed. He sat at the base of Manuel's grave, his posture calm, his eyes locked on the headstone. Diego took out a small notebook he had been carrying for the past week. Flipping to a fresh page, he jotted down the date and time. He had begun cataloging Tito's behavior, hoping patterns might emerge to explain the dog's actions. But the more notes he took, the more questions arose. "Tito," Diego said, his voice low and unsure, "you've got me tangled up in this. You know that." The dog didn't move. Diego sighed and closed the notebook. "I've got to figure this out, buddy. I need to know why you're here." After a few minutes, Diego pulled out his phone and opened his browser. If he couldn't ask Tito, he could at least dig into Manuel's life. He searched for obituaries, community announcements, anything that might offer a clue. The search turned up little. A brief mention of Manuel's passing in a local paper and a few condolences from neighbors who described him as quiet and kind. Frustrated but determined, Diego decided to approach the issue differently. He stood and walked toward the cemetery office, a small building tucked near the entrance. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with old paper. Behind the counter sat Mrs. Alvarez, the cemetery's longtime administrator. "Diego," she said warmly, looking up from her paperwork. "What brings you here? Usually you're out there making things spotless." Diego hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "Mrs. Alvarez, do you remember much about Don Manuel Garcia?" She tilted her head, her brow furrowing slightly. "Manuel? Oh yes, I remember him. He was a sweet man. Always brought those little wildflowers for his wife's grave. Why do you ask?" Diego leaned against the counter. "It's his dog Tito. He keeps coming back to Manuel's grave every day at the same time. I want to understand why." Mrs. Alvarez smiled faintly. "That doesn't surprise me. Manuel and that dog were inseparable. After his wife passed, Tito became his closest companion. Manuel once told me he wasn't sure who rescued who." Diego nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Do you know anything else about him? Something that might explain why the dog keeps coming back?" Mrs. Alvarez thought for a moment before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Diego. Manuel was private. He talked about his wife sometimes but never much about himself. The only thing I know is that he always made sure to come here at 4 o'clock. He said it was the time they used to meet when they were younger." Diego's chest tightened. 4 o'clock. The significance hit him like a wave. Tito wasn't just following routine. He was honoring a ritual, a time sacred to Manuel. "Thanks, Mrs. Alvarez," Diego said, his voice quieter now. "That helps a lot." Walking back to the grave, Diego carried a strange mix of sadness and admiration. Tito's presence here wasn't just loyalty, it was love, the kind that outlasts even the sharpest heartbreak. When Diego returned, Tito was lying down, his head resting on his paws. Diego sat beside him, the silence between them feeling more like a connection than an absence. "You're keeping his promise, aren't you?" Diego asked, almost to himself. Tito's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't move. For the first time, Diego felt like he was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about Manuel or Tito, it was about devotion, about the ways we hold on to the people who shape us. Sitting there, Diego felt something shift within him, a quiet realization that perhaps this journey wasn't just Tito's to take. Diego couldn't shake the weight of Mrs. Alvarez's words as he walked back to the grave. 4 o'clock, the time they used to meet. The significance of it all deepened his curiosity, and yet it left him unsettled. Was Tito aware of this, or was his routine a subconscious echo of the bond he shared with Manuel? Diego couldn't tell, but he was determined to uncover more. When he reached the grave, Tito was still there, lying down as if he belonged to the earth beneath him. Diego sat cross-legged a few feet away, the notebook resting in his lap. "You're one loyal dog," he muttered, flipping through the pages he had filled with observations and questions. He paused, staring at the inscription on Manuel's headstone. For the first time, Diego noticed the simplicity of it. No elaborate epitaph, no grand declarations. Just Manuel's name, the dates of his life, and a line that read, "Beloved husband and friend." Diego felt a pang in his chest, a reminder of how fleeting and fragile human connections could be. "Who were you, Manuel?" Diego said quietly, almost as if asking the grave itself. "And what made you and Tito so inseparable?" Diego leaned back, resting his elbows on the grass. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. For a brief moment, he let himself imagine Manuel's life, an older man walking these paths, a scruffy dog at his side, stopping at this very grave every day to honor a love that still lingered. As Diego sat in thought, a voice broke through the quiet. "You're still here?" Diego turned to see the same older man he had met a few days ago, the one who recognized Tito. The man's face was lined with experience, his eyes carrying a knowing softness. "Yeah," Diego replied, brushing grass off his hands as he stood. "Trying to figure this guy out?" He gestured toward Tito, who was now sitting upright, his head tilted as if listening to the conversation. The man nodded, stepping closer. "Manuel was a good man," he said, his voice steady. "Quiet but good. Kept to himself mostly. That dog, though, Tito was his world. I think losing his wife hit him hard, but Tito gave him something to hold on to." Diego crossed his arms, his gaze shifting between the man and Tito. "What kind of person keeps coming back to the same place every day even when it's just a memory?" The man smiled faintly. "The kind who knows that love doesn't end just because someone's gone. Manuel didn't visit because he couldn't move on. He came because it was his way of keeping her close. And Tito," he paused, looking at the dog. "I guess Tito learned that from him." Diego felt a lump rise in his throat. He cleared it quickly, nodding. "Do you know much about Manuel's life before? Like before his wife passed?" The man sighed, his hands slipping into his pockets. Not much. I know they met young. Manuel used to tell anyone who'd listen that he fell in love with her the moment he saw her. They built a good life together. Simple but full. The man gave Diego a pat on the shoulder before walking off, leaving Diego with his thoughts. He crouched back down next to Tito, his voice softer now. So, you're not just here for him. You're here for her too, aren't you? Tito didn't react, but Diego felt the truth in his own words. There was something about the dog's quiet persistence that mirrored Manuel's devotion, a love that had spanned years and still lingered in the silence of the cemetery. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Diego stood and stretched. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wildflowers he'd brought, placing them gently on the grave. Maybe it's time someone else helped you keep this going, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tito looked up at Diego, his dark eyes reflecting the fading light. For the first time, Diego felt like the dog was truly seeing him, not just as the caretaker of the cemetery, but as someone who understood the depth of what he was holding onto. That night, as Diego walked home, the cemetery felt different. The quiet paths, the weathered headstones, they weren't just reminders of loss anymore. They were threads of stories, weaving together lives, loves, and the loyalty that endured even after the last goodbyes. And for the first time, Diego felt himself becoming part of that tapestry. The next morning, Diego woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Tito wasn't just a dog to him anymore. He was a keeper of promises, a link to a love story that Diego couldn't ignore. As Diego pulled on his work boots and grabbed his bag, he resolved to learn more, not just about Manuel but about himself. The cemetery was quiet when he arrived, the early morning mist lingering over the graves. Tito wasn't there yet, and Diego used the time to prepare. He brought more wildflowers, arranging them neatly in a jar he'd taken from home. He also carried a small blanket, intending to sit by the grave for as long as it took to piece things together. At exactly 4 p.m. Tito arrived. Diego stood back, watching as the dog made his familiar journey. This time, though, Tito hesitated when he saw Diego already at the grave. The dog stopped a few paces away, his head tilting slightly. Diego smiled and crouched down, patting the ground beside him. "Come on, boy," he said gently. "I'm not here to take your place." Tito approached cautiously, his steps deliberate. He sat down beside Diego, his body close enough to touch but still carrying an air of independence. Diego placed the jar of flowers in front of the headstone and let the silence settle between them. "You know, Tito," Diego began, his voice quiet, "I've been thinking a lot about Manuel. About why you keep coming here. And I think I'm starting to understand." He paused, glancing at the dog. "This place isn't just about remembering. It's about keeping something alive." Tito's ears twitched, but he didn't look away from the grave. Diego felt a pang of something, respect, perhaps, or a shared understanding. He leaned back, his hands resting on the grass. "I don't know much about Manuel," Diego continued, "but I know he loved deeply. You don't keep coming back like this unless someone meant the world to you. And I think he meant the world to you too." The words felt heavy as they left Diego's mouth, but also freeing. For so long he had avoided thinking about connections, about people who mattered. His job at the cemetery had been an escape, a way to stay on the outskirts of life without diving into its messiness. But Tito's unwavering loyalty was pulling him out of that comfort zone, forcing him to confront what he'd been avoiding. A soft shuffle of footsteps pulled Diego's attention. He turned to see an elderly woman approaching, her hands clasped tightly around a small purse. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes carried a spark of warmth. "Excuse me," she said softly, her gaze shifting between Diego and Tito. "Are you the caretaker?" Diego nodded, standing. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you?" The woman smiled faintly, her attention drifting to the grave. "I'm Maria. I used to know Manuel. We lived on the same street for years." Her eyes lingered on Tito. "And that must be Tito. I thought he might have run off after Manuel passed." "No, ma'am," Diego replied. "He's been here. Every day." Maria's expression softened and she stepped closer. "That doesn't surprise me. Manuel and Tito were inseparable. He told me once that Tito was the last gift his wife gave him. Found the dog abandoned in a field and brought him home, said Manuel needed someone to look after." Diego's throat tightened. "He never mentioned that to anyone around here." Maria nodded, her gaze fixed on the flowers Diego had placed. Manuel wasn't the type to share much. But when you paid attention you could see it. His love for his wife never faded, not even after she was gone. And Tito? He was a reminder of that love. A piece of her he could hold on to. Diego felt a lump rise in his chest as Maria reached out and gently patted Tito's head. The dog stayed still, his eyes closing briefly under her touch. "You're doing a good thing looking after him," Maria said, her voice quiet. Manuel would have appreciated that. As Maria walked away, Diego sat back down beside Tito, his thoughts swirling. The dog had been more than a companion. He was a living connection to the people Manuel had loved. And in his own way, Tito had become part of Diego's life too, a reminder of what it meant to care deeply even when it hurt. Diego rested a hand on Tito's back. "I'll keep coming back," he said softly. "For you, for him, for all of it. I promise." For the first time, Tito leaned into Diego's touch, his body relaxing against the caretaker's side. The two of them sat there, bound by silence and the shared weight of an unspoken promise. The next morning, Diego arrived at the cemetery carrying a small envelope tucked into his back pocket. After his conversation with Maria, he felt compelled to learn more about Manuel, not just as a man who loved his dog, but as a person whose life had left such a quiet but profound legacy. Tito was already there when Diego reached Manuel's grave. The dog sat in his usual place, his posture as still and resolute as ever. Diego smiled faintly as he approached, setting down his bag of supplies. "Morning, Tito," Diego said, crouching beside him. The dog's ears flicked, acknowledging Diego's presence without breaking his focus on the headstone. Diego pulled the envelope from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a photocopy of an old photo that Maria had given him. It showed a much younger Manuel standing beside a woman with soft, kind eyes and a warm smile. They looked happy, their arms linked as if they were holding the world together. "This is her, isn't it?" Diego said, holding the photo where Tito could see it. "Manuel's wife. The one who brought you to him." Tito didn't react, but Diego felt the weight of the moment anyway. He stared at the picture, trying to piece together the fragments of a life he could only glimpse. Manuel's love for his wife was evident even in this single image, and it struck Diego that this same devotion now lived on through Tito. Diego set the photo gently beside the headstone, his voice soft. "I think you've been doing something amazing, Tito. You're not just coming back here for Manuel. You're here for both of them." As the words left his mouth, Diego felt a shift within himself. He thought about his own life, the loneliness he had accepted as normal, the routine he clung to because it felt safe. Watching Tito, Diego realized how deeply he had underestimated the power of connection. Even after loss, it could persist, threading through time and memory. Diego leaned back, his hands in the grass. "You've taught me more than you know," he said quietly, glancing at Tito. The dog finally turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Diego's. There was no way to know what Tito understood, but in that moment, Diego felt seen. The sound of footsteps pulled Diego's attention. Looking up, he saw Mrs. Alvarez walking toward him, holding a small, worn book. She offered him a warm smile as she approached. "I thought you might like this," she said, handing Diego the book. "I found it while going through some of the old cemetery records. Manuel used to write letters to his wife after she passed. He never sent them, of course, but he kept them tucked away in this journal." Diego stared at the book, its edges frayed from years of use. "He left this here?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "He gave it to me not long before he passed. Said it didn't feel right keeping it at home without her. I think he wanted it to stay close to her grave." Diego opened the journal carefully, his hands trembling slightly. The first page was dated just a few days after Manuel's wife had passed. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky, the words carrying an intimacy that made Diego feel like he was trespassing. "My dearest Elena," it began. "Today Tito and I visited you again. I know you're not truly here, but I feel closer to you when I sit by your side. Tito does too. He watches over me the way you always did. I think you would have liked how he's taken care of me." Diego read a few more lines before closing the journal, overwhelmed. He looked up at Mrs. Alvarez, who was watching him with a knowing expression. "I think you're meant to have this," she said gently. "You've been taking care of Tito, and by doing that you're taking care of Manuel's legacy too." Diego swallowed hard, nodding. "Thank you," he managed, his voice barely audible. As Mrs. Alvarez walked away, Diego placed the journal beside the photo on the grave. He rested his hand on Tito's back, his mind swirling with thoughts. This wasn't just a story about a man and his dog, it was a story about love, loyalty, and the small, profound ways we carry each other forward. For the rest of the day, Diego stayed by the grave, reading bits of the journal aloud to Tito. The dog lay quietly beside him, his presence steady and grounding. Diego didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Diego sat at the grave the next morning, the journal resting heavily in his lap. The weight of Manuel's words, each letter a testament to his devotion, lingered in Diego's mind. He had spent the night reading through its pages, feeling as if he were stepping into a life that wasn't his but somehow felt deeply familiar. Tito sat beside him as steady as ever. The dog's presence had become a strange comfort, a constant in a world Diego had only recently begun to truly see. "Tito," Diego said, breaking the silence, "did you know how much he loved her? I mean, you must have felt it. You were there for all of it." The dog glanced at him briefly before returning his focus to the grave. Diego chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Of course you did. You were part of it." Opening the journal again, Diego flipped to a page he had marked the night before. The date was just a week before Manuel's death. The handwriting was shakier, the words trailing off in places, but the emotion was as strong as ever. "My dearest Elena, I can feel the years catching up to me. Tito does too, I think. He stays closer these days, watches me like he knows something I don't. If this is my last letter to you, I want you to know that you were my greatest love, my reason for everything. And Tito, he's been my anchor, my reminder of you. I hope, when I'm gone, he finds someone who sees him the way we did." Diego closed the journal, the words echoing in his chest. He looked at Tito, who had laid down with his head resting on his paws. There was a peace to the dog's posture, as if he were fulfilling a purpose he didn't need anyone to understand. "You were his anchor," Diego said quietly. "And now you're still holding on. For both of them." The day passed slowly, the hours stretching as Diego stayed by the grave. He spoke to Tito in fits and starts as if the dog might answer. And in a way Tito did. The simple act of his presence, his unwavering devotion, spoke louder than words ever could. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Diego stood and stretched. He looked down at Tito, who had stayed beside him the entire time. "Come on, boy," Diego said, motioning toward the path. "Let's get you something to eat." Tito hesitated, glancing back at the grave. Diego knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's back. "We'll come back tomorrow," he promised. "But you've got to take care of yourself too." It took a moment, but Tito finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Together, they walked down the path, the silence between them filled with an unspoken understanding. Diego felt the weight of Manuel's words in his pocket, the journal a reminder of the connection they now shared. When they reached Diego's small apartment, Tito seemed hesitant, standing in the doorway as if unsure of his place. Diego crouched down, meeting the dog's eyes. "This is your home now, Tito," he said softly. "For as long as you need it to be." Tito stepped inside, his movements cautious but trusting. Diego set out a bowl of food and water, watching as the dog ate with a quiet intensity. It wasn't just about nourishment, it was about survival, about continuing forward. That night, as Diego lay in bed, he thought about the journal, about Manuel and Elena and the love that had brought them together. He thought about Tito, the bridge between their past and his present. And for the first time, Diego felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose, of belonging. Before falling asleep, Diego whispered into the quiet, "I'll take care of him, Manuel. I promise." The months passed quietly, each day weaving itself into a rhythm Diego hadn't realized he needed. Every morning he and Tito would walk to the cemetery, stopping at Manuel's grave. Diego would read passages from the journal aloud while Tito lay beside him, his loyalty undiminished. The routine had become sacred, a connection between the past and the present that neither of them could fully explain but both felt deeply. On a crisp autumn morning, Diego woke to find Tito moving slower than usual. The dog's once steady gait had grown tentative, his energy fading with the passage of time. Diego crouched beside him, gently stroking Tito's graying fur. "You've done a lot, haven't you, boy?" Diego murmured. Tito's eyes lifted to meet his, and in them, Diego saw a quiet understanding, a readiness even. That day their visit to the cemetery felt different. The air was still, the golden leaves falling softly around them. Diego carried the journal and a fresh bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind Manuel used to bring. Tito walked beside him, his steps slow but purposeful, as if he knew this would be the last time he made the familiar journey. When they reached the grave, Diego knelt and arranged the flowers carefully at the base of the headstone. Tito lay down beside him, his body settling into the grass with a heaviness that made Diego's chest tighten. He placed a hand on Tito's back, his voice steady despite the lump forming in his throat. "You've kept your promise," Diego said softly. "You've done everything you could. And you've taught me more than I can ever repay." Tito let out a soft sigh, his eyes closing as the warmth of Diego's hand rested on him. For a long moment they stayed like that, man and dog united in a bond that transcended words. Diego opened the journal to one of the final entries, his voice quiet but clear as he read. My dearest Elena, Tito and I visited you again today. He seems to know this place as well as I do now. I can't help but think he's the best part of me that I'll leave behind, the part that will stay even when I'm gone. I hope in some way he'll remind the world of what love can be. Diego closed the journal, his hands trembling slightly. He looked down at Tito, who had grown still, his breath shallow but calm. Tears blurred Diego's vision as he leaned closer, his voice breaking. It's okay, Tito, he whispered. You can rest now. You've done more than enough. As the sun began to set, bathing the cemetery in soft, golden light, Tito took his last breath. Diego stayed beside him, his hand resting on the dog's back, the quiet settling around them like a blanket. Later that evening, Diego carefully buried Tito near Manuel's grave, placing a simple marker beside the headstone. It read, Tito, a loyal friend. Diego stood back, the weight of grief heavy but not overwhelming. He felt something else too, gratitude for the time he'd shared with Tito, for the lessons the dog had taught him about love, loyalty, and the importance of showing up even when it's hard. For the first time in years, Diego didn't feel alone. The legacy of Manuel, Elena, and Tito had become part of his own life, a reminder that love in all its forms could outlast even the deepest loss. As he left the cemetery, Diego turned back one last time. The grave, the flowers, and the small marker glowed softly in the fading light, a testament to a story that would never truly end. In the end, this story isn't just about a dog, a man, or a grave. It's about the unbreakable bond between love and memory, a reminder that loyalty and devotion can transcend even the deepest losses. Tito's journey, though quietly heroic, reflects a truth we all share. Love leaves a mark that time cannot erase. If this story moved you, take a moment to honor it. Like the video to show that Tito's loyalty inspired you. Share it with someone who understands the power of love and connection. And if you want more stories that touch the heart and remind us of life's most profound lessons, subscribe to the channel. Because some stories deserve to be remembered just like Tito's.